Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of When One Thing Ends, Another Can Begin. This will be Part 5, the second half to Chapter 3. Izuku tried blinking the blurriness out of his eyes again, but when that failed, he decided it was a lost cause, laying his head back down on the desk. He hoped that the day would go quickly. He opened one eye a crack when he felt a presence beside him, and was greeted by a blur of purple that was probably Shinso. Someone didn't have a good night's sleep. The drawl confirmed Izuku's guess, and he groaned in reply as he turned his head to better see him. Shinso's reaction to seeing his eye bags was instant. Holy shit, dude. Do you have luggage tags for those? What happened? Since Bakugo hadn't made it to class yet, Izuku was comfortable enough to stretch out, letting his arms fall to the front of his desk. His voice was muffled, from where he'd squashed it into his arms again. I didn't really sleep last night. No shit. Insomnia? Not really. I have trouble getting to sleep, but I think that's from something else. His mind helpfully supplied a few recurring thought spirals that often kept him up, combined with the nightmares that still appeared more often than not. And shouldn't they have gone away by now? Things were getting better. He should be better. His sleep schedule was chaotic, at best. I was doing a bit of research while I waited to feel tired, which is normally what I do, but right as I was about to go to bed, I got a notification from a forum I help moderate. Usually people don't notify me for things since they know I'm busy and I'm not as active as I used to be, so I had to check it out. Really, it was a shame that he couldn't be as active anymore. Growing up without friends and with near unrestricted internet access had meant a lot of his free time had been spent trawling the internet for hero and quirk facts, until he'd eventually found himself a place across multiple forums dedicated to those subjects. He'd started off mostly viewing others' content, but he'd slowly moved to be a fact-checker, sometimes posting his own observations, until eventually he was given a moderator status. It was only simple stuff, like making sure content was kept relevant and no hate was spread, but his ability to enter accounts and change other people's settings and accessing rights from their end had seen him gain popularity amongst the other mods. When he'd said he'd need to take a step back, there had been a lot of outcry, so eventually they'd settled on a compromise of only notifying him when something important was happening, or a problem arose that they couldn't solve. It had felt nice, feeling so wanted, and going through those forums had been a good way to fill in time the past week. It turned out that someone was spreading some hateful stuff, and the other mods couldn't figure out if it was just the usual trolling hero hate that shows up on these forums, or an actual threat. So I looked into what they were sharing, which was some usual heroes suck stuff, except they were advocating for killing heroes, which is always a big warning sign. When I looked into their account, I found out this was actually a specific manifesto from a villain about killing heroes who are unworthy or fakes. Maybe an hour of research revealed quite the extensive history, since before turning villain he used to be a vigilante, which led me to the question of why he was advocating for killing heroes after a fairly aggressive vigilante career. I ended up sending him a message, and then gave a warning to the account that was spreading his manifesto, but I don't know if that'll fix the problem. I'll have to keep watch over the next couple of days. Anyway, I only got to sleep at 3 a.m. because of that, and my alarm goes off at 4. Shinso took the next few moments to seemingly try and understand the muffled dump of information he'd just been presented with. Wait, your alarm goes off at 4 a.m.? Izuku could only awkwardly shrug his shoulders from his position on the desk. When Bakugo entered the class with a slammed door, he reluctantly sat up. The blonde had been ignoring him for the most part, but that didn't mean Izuku trusted him to keep it that way. The rest of the day proceeded slowly in the wake that only sleep deprivation could make it go. Every time he blinked, there seemed to be new information he had to act on, but it was endless. Like the world was conspiring to make sure he'd never get to bed again. Fortunately, this wasn't his first time struggling through a school day with little to no sleep, so no one called him out on his behavior or performance, but it still sucked. Especially since they'd had a period of physical training. Izuku had been able to keep up with his classmates for the most part, but that was just because they weren't using their quirks. He had to do better than them if he was ever going to become a hero. He'd already added more routines to his usual morning exercise, but he needed more than casual exercising to stop himself from falling behind. Finally getting home felt like a relief, especially since Inko was home at the same time as him for once. They exchanged a bit of small talk, asking how the other was and what had happened during the day. She also asked when his next tutoring session would be. He hadn't wanted to worry her by saying he was working with the principal, or get her hopes up only for them to fall if the meetings were discontinued. And he let her know that, circumstances permitting, it should be tomorrow. It was nice to talk for a bit before he headed off to his room with a yawn. He wanted nothing more, to just collapse into bed and sleep until his alarm went off. But there were still things he had to do before that. So he sat at his desk. He resolved to check for updates, then do his homework. And by then, dinner should be ready. After dinner, he could finally sleep. As he expected, the first thing he saw was a ping from one of the other mods thanking him for dealing with it, even though the issue wasn't completely resolved yet. He also wasn't surprised to find that the offending account had told him that his warning was bullshit and that they were just spreading the truth. Izuku just sighed and sent a final message notifying the account that if they didn't stop, instead of being suspended or muted, Izuku would just delete it. Yes, there were problems with the system, but there was a separate section of the forum dedicated to that sort of discussion. He made sure that that was included in his message before he sent it off, hoping that the user would back down so he didn't actually have to delete their account. Of course, they could make a new account, but if they kept spreading a murderous manifesto, Izuku would have to delete that account and block them from creating any more. What surprised him was the email waiting for him. He'd expected a reply along the lines of, "Who the hell is this and how did you get my contact information?" Since that was the standard first response, and this wasn't the first time he'd reached out to someone like this, but he must have included enough information in his initial email for Stain to reply in full. The tone of the message was wary, very, very wary, which made sense given Stain's status as a wanted criminal. And wanted criminals rarely had someone reach out to them out of the blue, asking politely to stop spreading the message of killing heroes, or preferably, to stop killing heroes at all. Izuku had tried, in the past, to ask criminals to stop outright, usually accompanied with a threat to report them, but that never worked. After all, most criminals had a reason for acting the way they did. Something provoked that mindset, their actions, and unless that base problem could be addressed, it was incredibly hard to stop them without being directly, physically involved. And Izuku definitely wasn't qualified for that, especially considering he'd first started doing this years ago, when he had even less experience around criminals than villains. In the end, Stain's message could be boiled down to a repeat of his mantra. He needed to stain himself in blood by killing fake pro-heroes in order for the world to see the flaws in the heroic system. Only then could a true rival of heroics happen, creating a just world filled with true heroes. There was also more than a few threats asking how Izuku had gotten his contact details and what he would do if he ever found out who Izuku was. Reading through it all, Izuku felt a different kind of exhaustion settle into his bones. He needed a good way to reply, a way to handle this that wouldn't make anything worse. After all, it was hard to convince someone that they're wrong when the basis of their ideals weren't. He sent off his email an hour later, eyes once again beginning to unfocus. He decided to ask about Stain's time as Stendhal. Looking it up, he hadn't been able to find the switching point between the two identities, and while Stain was known for killing heroes, he still targeted villains like in his time as Stendhal. So he'd written up a few questions asking what had changed that made him become Stain over Stendhal, and what constitutes as a true hero. He hoped it was enough for Stain to warrant responding again. If he did, then he'd be able to work from there. Inko found him, half an hour later, when she called him for dinner, asleep at his desk. They both shared a laugh at that before Izuku was able to eat, then finally drift off in his bed. Usually when Hisashi let his hair down at the end of the day, shaking out the worst of the hairspray, then washing the rest away, he could finally relax. Which arguably wasn't a lot since he had 3 jobs and a Shota, who needed to be reminded to eat or he'd try and survive on juice packs. But it was still a good signifier for his body to begin unwinding. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case this evening. He wandered to the kitchen absent-mindedly, grabbed yesterday's leftovers, then joined Shota on the couch, where he was hunched over some paperwork. "Hey, how was the show?" The question was more habit than genuine interest, but for all his gruff demeanor, Shota did care. When it took more than a few seconds for Hisashi to complain about some interview or sponsorship, rambled about a new artist, or jokingly whine, "Aw, Shota, does that mean you didn't listen to it? How could you betray me like this?" Shota immediately looked up from his work. It was fine. Shota didn't even have to change his facial expression for Hisashi to read the "that's a bullshit answer" written across it. "No, really, it was. I just happened to speak to your problem kid today." That statement had Shota putting his paperwork onto the coffee table and turning to face Hisashi fully. Did you notice anything off with him in homeroom this morning? The question had Shota looking tense, probably reflecting on the morning and trying to figure out what he'd missed. No, not if you count looking slightly sleep-deprived and ready to bolt at a moment's notice as off, though he looks like that every day. Hisashi hummed at that. How much have you talked to Midoriya? Can you stop with the questions and tell me what's wrong with my student? Shota snapped. I promise, I'm going to tell you. Hisashi tried to make a placating gesture, knowing that it wouldn't really work. If there was one thing anyone close to Shota knew, it was not to mess with his students. I just want to know, do you talk to the kid? The man sighed, leaning back into the couch while still keeping an eye on Hisashi. Not really. I try to interact with him in homeroom and make sure he gets the recognition he deserves in training. But I haven't reached out to him much. Those first few days when I asked him to stay behind or gave him a note from Nezu, there would be a flash where he'd look like I'd handed him a death sentence. I doubt talking to any authority figure has been a good experience for him in the past, so I've mostly been trying to establish myself as a steady presence, someone he can rely on, and not pushing him. That way he might actually trust me and come to me with his problems. Now tell me, what happened? Hisashi thought back to that afternoon, when he'd seen the kid. Midoriya had been limping, though he'd hidden it well. In fact, Hisashi wouldn't have noticed it at all if he hadn't gone through the heroic system with Aizawa I'm fine Shota. So he'd approached the kid to ask if he was all right. Immediately, Midoriya had waved off his concern, insisting he was fine, until Hisashi had been able to point out that he'd already noticed the limping, that could only have come from a leg or back issue. That had the kid clamming up immediately. Taking a guess, though hoping he was wrong, he'd asked if it was Midoriya's classmates. Luckily for them, however, Midoriya had jumped to their defense instantly, calling them wonderful and nice and smart and all other manner of compliments. So Hisashi had asked again, because if it wasn't his classmates, what had happened? If it was training, the kid should have gone to Recovery Girl. Midoriya made a face at that suggestion, curling into himself a little, mumbling about not wanting to bother her, especially because it had happened outside of school and he'd be fine. It had taken a little bit more of pressure, but he'd finally gotten an answer. Shota. He was involved in a mugging last night. Hisashi watched as Shota closed his eyes and took several deep breaths. I take it he didn't think to report it. Oh no, he did. Hisashi took that moment to pull out his phone, opening up the Heroics Network, selecting an area of Musutafu and scrolling up the logs from the night patrol, until finding the one he was looking for. And he used the Heroics Network to do so. Shota stared at him for a second before snatching the phone out of his hands, looking at the tiny, immediate response notification. The notifications weren't that unusual, especially when there were multiple villains involved or police assistance was required, but what was unusual was that this one had no name attached. Every hero, sidekick, or intern given access to the Hero Network had their hero name or a code to accompany their messages, but this one was blank. I'm going to need an explanation, right now, was all Shota said as he handed his phone back. So Hisashi began relaying the story he'd managed to pry from Midoriya that he hadn't been able to stop thinking about since he heard it. Apparently, he was already out late to buy some food, snacks, along with eggs and milk for the morning. It sounded like he was intentionally avoiding main roads, which I asked him about, and he just muttered something about his way being quicker and good exercise. He said he was familiar with the area, so it usually wasn't a problem, but then he stumbled onto a mugging. Hisashi sighed, remembering the almost desperate tone of Midoriya's voice as he tried to play off the incident. When I asked why he didn't call the police or a hero agency, he gave me a full rundown of the area's heroes, their patrol routes, and how they wouldn't be able to make it on time, even with an immediate response notification on the Hero Network. Same thing with the police. He knew exactly how to calculate their response time, even breaking it down to people available and transit considerations. I'm pretty sure the only reason he let slip he had access to the Hero Network is because he was trying to justify that he'd done what he could, as if I was going to accuse him of being a vigilante. So with no one available, he decided to take things into his own hands. Oh, Shota did not sound impressed. Yes and no. From what I can make sense of, if he hadn't have intervened, things would have ended badly. And he didn't try fighting them, in fact. I think his technique is piss them off so they chase him, which honestly sounds worse, though. Of course, when I pointed that out, he just waved me off saying that he was familiar with the area, so it was easy enough to avoid them. Except one of the assailants threw his knife, which managed to nick the kid's leg, hence the limp. You don't get a limp from a little cut. Hisashi pulled a face at Shota. Yeah, try telling a stubborn teenager about injury severity when they're determined to hide it from you. I sure wouldn't have experience dealing with that situation. His voice was dripping with sarcasm as he directed that last part at Shota, who had pushed himself far past his limits in their last year of UA, and their first year as heroes. He eventually agreed to get Recovery Girl to look at it, but I'm not sure if he actually followed through. Shota hummed, no doubt weighing the pros and cons of bringing up the issue with the boy himself. Honestly, I'm more concerned about how he brushed off the whole thing. What he said sounded like a full mugging intervention, followed by a chase around neighboring blocks while he waited for heroes to get there. He even spoke about finding the victim after they'd run off, and guiding them to the grocery store so they could be in relative safety before contacting police. That's the kind of stuff you learn towards the end of first year and through internships, yet the whole time Midoriya downplayed his part, as if he'd done nothing but stall for a bit of time and getting hurt was just a silly mistake on his part. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, fiddling with the ends of it. I told Nezu about the incident, and that he has access to the Hero Network. He snorted then. If it were anyone else, I don't think Nezu would have believed it. Hell, I probably wouldn't have, but it's Midoriya, Shota finished for him. They had been around this kid for under 2 weeks, and already they were adapting to the impossibilities this kid could pull off, all without thinking it's a big deal. It's amazing what that kid can do, but knowing he's only gotten this far, learned all this, because he was alone with no one to believe in him, it's heartbreaking, you know? Shota was quiet. Hisashi could tell he was processing it all. He'd been in a similar state at the end of the first day, eventually telling Hisashi about the kid's breakdown, all because Shota had said that it was possible for him to be a hero. The voice hero finished his dinner in silence, put the plate away before joining Shota on the couch again. He's going to get himself killed. Hisashi gave Shota a look at that, considering how ironic it was coming from him, Mr. Lone Wolf, so concerned that another kid would decide the only way forward was alone. It did make sense, however. Shota had eventually come around to his and Nemuri's arguing and pleading that he wasn't looking after himself, and he probably didn't want to see someone else have to go through that same process. What did he say when you questioned him about the Hero Network? Hisashi laughed at that one, the kind of laugh when it isn't actually funny, but it's the best part of a bad situation. After looking incredibly caught out, he said it wasn't that difficult to get access to. After that, I didn't think to question more about it, though now I wish I knew how he managed that. Shota laughed a bit at that, joining Hisashi, though a tone of sadness carried through it. It was a laugh that two of them had shared before, a laugh developed from years spent working in an unforgiving industry together. We'll help him, Shota. He has people who believe in him now, has support. He'll learn it's okay to use it. He shifted closer, wrapping an arm around the other man's shoulders, hoping that he'd pick up on the underlying message of, like you do. I hope so. All right, listeners, this concludes Chapter 3 of When One Thing Ends, Another Can Begin. Chapter 4 will be up next. I hope you all are still enjoying this one. I'm eager to hear your thoughts and reactions as always, though. Thank you so much for listening.